My name is Michael Drew, and if you had asked me a year ago what the slow death of a marriage feels like, I would have said, quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable. Because that's how Claire and I faded. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with tiny fractures that grew silently until one evening, everything just snapped. 12 years together had taught me her rhythms, the way she laughed, the way she sighed, the way she filled a room. But recently that warmth had been replaced by something colder than silence, indifference. It wasn't even hostile, just empty. That evening, wanting to bring back something familiar, I cooked her favorite comfort meal: roasted chicken, vegetables, garlic bread. Our tiny apartment smelled like the early years of our marriage. When she walked in, her smile flashed for half a second, the ghost of the woman I once knew, then vanished as she sat down. Her eyes immediately locked onto her phone. She didn't ask about my day. She didn't even look at the table I'd spent an hour preparing. She just scrolled. I tried to ignore the familiar ache tightening in my chest. "I made your favorite," I said softly. She looked up briefly. "Thanks," she said, her tone flat, empty, automatic. I tried to lighten the mood. "If the chicken's terrible, we can just pretend it's romantic to have wine and salad," I joked lightly. She laughed, but it wasn't real. It wasn't even kind. It was the laugh you give a stranger who said something awkward. "Michael, you're ridiculous," she said, waving it off like I was nothing more than background noise. The fork trembled in my hand. Something shifted inside me, then not anger, not heartbreak, something quieter and far more final. I started noticing everything. The way her body leaned away from me. The way she checked her phone after every sentence. The way she sighed whenever I tried to speak. The way her eyes never softened toward me anymore. I pushed through the discomfort and tried again. "Tough day at work?" I asked. She shrugged. "Yep, no detail, no warmth, no connection." I told her a funny story from my office, one that normally would have made her laugh. Instead, she leaned back, gave me a dismissive glance, and said, "You're taking this way too seriously. Can you just relax? It's just a joke." And that was the moment everything clicked. It wasn't the sentence. It was the tone behind it, the tone of someone who no longer respected me enough to care about my feelings. I felt something in my chest go still. I wasn't hurt anymore, just tired, exhausted from years of small cuts and invisible bruises. I put my fork down. I stood up. And for the first time in months, she finally looked at me. Confusion flickered in her eyes. But it was too late. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a scene. I simply stood, grabbed my coat, and walked toward the doorway. The weight lifting from my shoulders felt unfamiliar, not happiness, but clarity. I paused before leaving and looked at her one last time. Her expression wasn't sorrow. It wasn't apology. It was irritation, annoyance, like my pain was an inconvenience. That's when I understood. I hadn't been her partner for years. I'd been her placeholder, her emotional furniture. And I finally refused to be something she walked around without ever seeing. The cold evening air hit my face. It felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in years. My phone buzzed. It was my friend Daniel. "How was dinner? Everything good?" I stared at the message. "How do you summarize 12 years of slow emotional starvation?" I didn't reply. I just kept walking. For the first time in ages, I wasn't rushing home to avoid an argument or walking slower to delay a cold night. I was simply walking free. Daniel called a few minutes later. "You okay?" he asked. I inhaled deeply. "I just needed to leave." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Want me to pick you up?" "No," I said softly. "I need air." As I wandered through quiet streets lit by warm street lamps, memories hit me like soft waves. Nights she turned away when I reached for her, days she barely acknowledged me, conversations where my words evaporated before reaching her, efforts she dismissed as me overreacting or being dramatic. I had mistaken her neglect for stress, for busyness, for a temporary disconnection, but now, seeing her face as I stood up, I knew it was permanent. When I reached Daniel's apartment, he didn't bombard me with questions. He simply opened the door and let me in. We sat in silence. No analysis, no advice. Just presence, something I hadn't felt at home in a very long time. That night I slept deeper than I had in years. Freedom doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels like finally letting gravity take over after holding your breath for too long. The next morning, I made a decision, quiet, steady, irreversible. I wasn't going back. Not to fight, not to explain, not to negotiate. I called a lawyer, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I wanted clarity, boundaries, a clean path forward. The following days were a strange blend of relief and grief. Relief that I had finally walked away from a love that no longer loved me. Grief that it had ended with silence instead of a final embrace. Claire texted me days later, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because her urgency no longer dictated my peace. For the first time in years, my life was my own. I started rediscovering old parts of myself, making coffee exactly how I like it, taking long walks without worrying about being home on time, listening to music at full volume, spending evenings with friends who actually saw me. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had abandoned for too long. Claire was no longer the center of my world. She was a closed chapter, meaningful once, but finished now. One evening, standing on Daniel's balcony overlooking the city lights, I realized something. Sometimes leaving isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning you were denied for too long. No yelling, no bitter goodbye. Just a quiet, certain decision that love without presence is no love at all. Walking away that night wasn't losing, it was choosing respect, choosing dignity, choosing myself. And as I stepped into my new life slower, calmer, clearer, I finally understood. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up from the table where love is no longer being served. Thank you for listening. If you've ever felt unseen or unheard in a relationship, remember that your peace matters. Sometimes the quietest goodbyes are the most profound. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories.